Welcome to Part 4 of the voiceover lecture for Chapter 7, the Nervous System. If you haven't already, watch Parts 1, 2, and 3. In previous videos for this chapter, we've already discussed Sections 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. In this video, we will discuss Section 6 on the brain and cranial nerves. Section 6, the brain and cranial nerves. Like we did with the spinal cord, let's begin by describing the protective structures that surround the brain. Like the spinal cord, the brain is surrounded by a bony structure. In this case, it's called the cranium. The cranium is the bony structure, the part of the skull that encases and protects the brain. The cavity in which the brain sits in the skull is called the cranial cavity. Again, this provides a protective shelter that protects the somewhat soft brain from mechanical damage. Like we saw with the spinal cord, the brain is surrounded by several layers of tissue called meninges, spaces in between those layers, and cerebrospinal fluid. Just like with the spinal cord, the meninges are in the same order and same orientation, and the spaces are also the same. There is one exception. The dura mater that surrounds the brain comes in two layers instead of one single layer. But the arachnoid mater is the same, the subarachnoid space is the same, filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and the pia mater is the meninge that's wrapped around the brain. It comes the closest to the actual brain itself. This diagram shows a frontal section of the top of the brain. We'll talk more about this later, but the cerebrum of the brain, the wrinkly part, comes in two hemispheres, right and left hemispheres. That's what's depicted with these two regions here. The pia mater, this kind of yellow line right against the cerebrum, is the deepest meninge. This black region here is the subarachnoid space. Remember, that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This thin purple line above that space is the arachnoid mater. Above that, the pink line is the dura mater, which also exists up against the skull, up above. Because remember, again, the dura mater comes in two layers around the brain. This blue region is the space between the two layers of dura mater. That's called the dural sinus. They didn't show in this diagram the subdural space, but that would be between the dura and arachnoid maters. You may have heard of the disease meningitis. Meningitis is an acute inflammation of the protective layers surrounding the brain or spinal cord. Symptoms include fever, headache, neck stiffness, and confusion. Meningitis is usually caused by an infection of the meninges or the spaces in between. This can be an infection caused by various different types of bacteria, viruses, or fungi. Meningitis is very serious and is life-threatening. In fact, bacterial meningitis is almost always fatal if left untreated, and meningitis claims hundreds of thousands of deaths worldwide each year. Now let's talk about the anatomy of the brain. The brain is divided into four major regions. First, we have the Diencephalon, which can be seen here deep in the middle of the brain. Next is the brainstem, coming out of the diencephalon, which is continuous with the spinal cord. Third, we have the cerebellum, this region of the brain here behind the brainstem. And then finally, the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain, which sits on top of all the other regions. Before I get into all of the details and functions of each part of the brain, let's start with an overview of the major regions of the brain. Let's start with the diencephalon. The diencephalon is made of three parts that I would like you to know: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and pineal gland. The next major region is the brainstem, and the parts I'd like you to know are the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The next major region is the cerebellum, and there are no real major parts of the cerebellum that I'm going to ask you about. Finally, we have the cerebrum. The cerebrum is composed of two major layers, the cerebral cortex and the subcortical region. The cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter. Gray matter is made of the cell bodies or soma of neurons and dendrites of neurons. The subcortical region, which is deeper than the cerebral cortex, is the layer that's often referred to as white matter. White matter is composed of axons that are covered in myelin. Not all axons are covered in myelin, but these ones are. And remember, myelin is a fatty tissue, and that fatty layer is what gives white matter its color. Notice that the gray matter and white matter of the brain are the inverse of what we saw in the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the gray matter was the deeper layer, and the white matter was the more superficial layer. Here in the brain, it's the opposite. The cerebral cortex of the cerebrum is divided into four major lobes. These include the frontal lobe, here in blue, the parietal lobe in yellow, the temporal lobe, this region in green, and the occipital lobe, which is at the back of the brain, here in pink. The subcortical region of the cerebrum has three regions I'd like you to know: the basal nuclei, amygdala, and corpus callosum. Something you've probably noticed about the brain is that the cerebrum has wrinkles, a series of grooves, and ridge-like bumps. Let's discuss these structures. Gyri are the ridge-like bumps on the surface of the brain. It can be seen here, and in a cross-section, here are the gyri. The term gyri is pronounced gyrus when it's singular. There are several important gyri: the precentral or motor gyrus and the postcentral or somatosensory gyrus. Sulci are the shallow grooves that are found on either side of the gyri. There are several important sulci: the central, lateral cerebral, and parietal occipital sulci. The singular for sulci is sulcus. You can see in the cross-section that the sulci are found on either side of a gyrus. Finally, we have fissures. Fissure is a much deeper groove than a sulcus. There is one particularly important fissure that's very predominant on the cerebral cortex of the brain, and that's the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure divides the brain into its left and right hemispheres. Here is a superior view of the cerebral cortex. You can clearly see the longitudinal fissure down the midline of the brain, dividing the cerebrum into the left and right hemispheres. Here's a diagram of a superior view of the cerebrum. Let's go over some of the structures. Here you can see the longitudinal fissure down the center of the cerebrum. You can also see several of the lobes. The anterior lobe of the cerebrum is the frontal lobe. In the middle here in blue is the parietal lobe, and at the back of the brain is the occipital lobe. You can see some of the important gyri are labeled. So even though the wrinkles appear to be somewhat random, they're actually fairly distinct and can be named and labeled and identified. Here they've cut a little patch of the brain out, and we're looking at a frontal section of the brain. The pink part of this diagram represents the gray matter of the brain, or the cerebral cortex as it's known. And then the white region is the white matter, also known as the subcortical region of the brain. Again, you can see the gyrus or gyri, the wrinkles, the shallow grooves or sulci, and then the deep groove down the center is the longitudinal fissure. Now let's discuss some of the important functions of the cerebrum, beginning with the frontal lobe. Within the frontal lobe are three regions I want you to know. First is the primary motor cortex. This region controls voluntary contractions of muscles and works in association with other motor areas of the brain. Damage to this region may result in partial paralysis. Second is the prefrontal cortex. This large anterior area controls many higher functions that we call executive functions. So the prefrontal cortex controls functions such as personality, intellect, reasoning, planning, understanding the consequences of our actions, and the suppression of urges that may be socially unacceptable. Last in the frontal lobe is Broca's area. This region controls aspects of language. Especially important is its role in controlling the movements involved in communication. People who have damage to this region describe knowing what they want to say but being unable to get the words out. Broca's area is relegated to the left hemisphere in most people, but in some it's found in the right hemisphere. Here we have a left lateral view of the brain showing some of the regions we've just discussed. This area of the brain is the frontal lobe. It's divided from the parietal lobe by a sulcus called the central sulcus, seen right here. Just anterior to the central sulcus is the primary motor area. So that's designated by this gyrus right here. Remember, that's the region that controls voluntary muscle contractions. This pink region of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex. Remember, this controls the executive functions that we discussed. And right here is Broca's area, which is involved in movements and communication. Next up is the parietal lobe of the brain. There are two regions in the parietal lobe that I'd like you to know. First, the somatosensory area. Let's break down the name. Somato meaning body, and sensory meaning sensations. So this area is responsible for being aware of sensations in our body, that is our skin, our muscle, and our joints, and is not involved in the special senses, those senses from our eyes, ears, and the other senses in our head. Secondly, we have the posterior parietal cortex. This region is involved in spatial reasoning and attention. Once again, here's a right lateral view of the brain. In this diagram, the parietal lobe isn't quite highlighted, but it's in this region right here. I'm showing with my laser. And with the two regions within the parietal lobe you need to know, again, are the primary somatosensory area. That's this darker blue gyrus right here. And just behind that is the posterior parietal cortex. Next is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe contains one area I'd like you to know, the vision cortex. The vision cortex receives and interprets visual information. It's the area of the brain that lets us see. The last lobe is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe has three areas that I'd like you to know. First is the auditory cortex. As the name implies, it receives and interprets sound. It's the area of the brain that lets us hear. Next is Wernicke's area. Like Broca's area, Wernicke's area is involved in speech. But Wernicke's area is more involved in the comprehension of speech. Remember, damage to Broca's area causes the can't get the words out effect. In contrast, a person with damage to Wernicke's area can speak individual words fluently, but when these words are strung together, they lack coherent meaning. Like Broca's area, Wernicke's area is located in the left hemisphere in most people. And finally, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is involved in long-term memory and emotions. It's one of the first areas of the brain that's damaged in most types of dementia, including Alzheimer's. Again, here's a right lateral view of the brain. In this diagram, you can see the visual cortex of the occipital lobe, highlighted here. You can also see Wernicke's area of the temporal lobe, outlined with these dashes here, and the auditory area of the temporal lobe in this area here. The hippocampus has not been highlighted in this diagram, but is somewhere in this region, in the middle of the temporal lobe. The last major area of the cerebrum is the subcortical region. Again, this is the area below the cortex. There are three areas of the subcortical region that I'd like you to know. First, we have the basal nuclei. This part of the brain controls complex movements along with the primary motor cortex and other regions of the brain, such as the cerebellum. The amygdala is involved in emotional memories and sexual interactions. And the corpus callosum is the area of the cerebrum that connects the left and right hemispheres. This is where motor and sensory information crosses to opposite sides of the body. This is in part why the right hemisphere of your brain controls the left side of your body, and the left hemisphere of your brain controls the right side of your body. To explore these subcortical regions, let's look at a mid-sagittal section of the brain. The area in pink is the corpus callosum. This ridge right here. Again, that's the area that connects the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. This little lump here is the amygdala. There's an amygdala in both the right and left hemispheres. The basal nuclei are scattered throughout this area here of the brain. Here's a mid-sagittal section of a real human brain. In this diagram, only the corpus callosum is really apparent, and again can be seen as this ridge right here. Remember, the brain is divided into four regions. We've just discussed the cerebrum. Now let's explore the diencephalon. There are three areas to know. First is the thalamus. The thalamus serves as a relay station. It relays both sensory and motor information. Sensory information coming from the body goes through the thalamus first before being sent to the somatosensory area of the cerebrum. Motor information from the primary motor cortex travels through the thalamus before being sent to other important motor areas, such as the cerebellum. Next is the hypothalamus. The name literally means below the thalamus, because it is situated below and a bit anterior to the thalamus in the brain. The hypothalamus is mainly an endocrine gland and helps regulate the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus contains two important structures, including the pituitary gland and mammillary bodies. We'll come back to more details of the hypothalamus in Bio 51 when we discuss the endocrine system. And thirdly, in the diencephalon is the pineal gland. It is also an endocrine gland. The pineal gland secretes the hormone melatonin, which helps regulate our sleep-wake cycle, in other words, our circadian rhythm. Again, we'll discuss further details of the pineal gland when we get into the chapter on the endocrine system. In this mid-sagittal section of the brain, you can see the three areas of the diencephalon. The thalamus, located in this region here, the hypothalamus, sort of below and forward, this pointy area of the brain here, and then finally the pineal gland, which is sort of behind the thalamus in this area here. The next major region of the brain is the brainstem. The brainstem sits below the diencephalon and is continuous with the spinal cord. The brainstem is divided into 3 regions. First is the midbrain. The midbrain plays a role in eye movements. Also, the neurotransmitter dopamine is produced in the midbrain. Dopamine plays a role in body movements. In Parkinson's disease, cells in the midbrain die, resulting in a dopamine deficit and thus causing abnormalities in the movements of the body. Also in the brainstem is the pons. The pons serves as a relay station between the cerebellum and cerebrum. The pons is located just anterior to the cerebellum. And finally is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata controls many autonomic functions and helps regulate our rate of breathing, our heart rate, and controls many reflexes or involuntary movements such as vomiting, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping. The medulla oblongata contains the pyramidal tracts, and in fact this is where the pyramidal tracts cross. The pyramidal tracts contain motor neurons, so this is another area where left hemisphere activities control the right side of the body, and vice versa. Here's a lateral view of the brain, showing the brainstem. Sitting at the top of the brainstem is the midbrain, here in blue. Below the midbrain is the pons. The pons would be connected to the cerebellum, which would be here just behind the pons. And then below the pons in pink is the medulla oblongata, which would continue on to form the spinal cord. Sitting atop of the midbrain, this thing in green, is the thalamus. And finally we have the 4th major region of the brain, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is actually the 2nd largest brain region. It's located posterior to the pons. Like the cerebrum, the cerebellum is divided into 2 hemispheres, left and right. The cerebellum superficially resembles a butterfly shape. The function of the cerebellum is to refine complex movements. So note that the cerebellum doesn't initiate movements, it smooths them out and helps coordinate them. In this mid-sagittal section of the brain, you can see the cerebellum located here. This region right here. Anterior to the cerebellum is the pons, this kind of larger, swollen region of the brainstem. Above the pons was the midbrain, and below the pons is the medulla oblongata. And that concludes our voiceover lecture series on Chapter 7, the nervous system. Let's end it with this cool video showing a frontal brain scan.